So yeah, I'll give you a bit of an overview of what cognitive load theory is, and then give a description of the resources that we've developed here at CESE to support teachers to use cognitive load theory in their classroom. And then Dan will kind of step in and talk about how our work on cognitive load theory has been taken up on the ground in classrooms and schools across the state. So we'll leave some time at the end of both presentations for any questions. So, what is cognitive load theory? So there's a growing interest in this area of research. So Dylan William, the man himself, described cognitive load theory as the single most important thing for teachers to know, which I think alerted our attention at CESE to the importance of this area of research. So what is cognitive load theory? It's basically a theory of how the human brain learns and stores knowledge, and it takes knowledge of human cognitive architecture to develop teaching strategies that are kind of based around our understanding of human cognitive architecture. So outside of cognitive load theory, we already have a sort of existing body of research from cognitive science and psychology about what human cognitive architecture looks like. And what cognitive load theory does is to take that pre-existing understanding of cognitive architecture and then, to develop teaching strategies that will fit within the characteristics of how human brains think and learn. So it's built upon two sort of broadly accepted ideas. The first is that there's a limit to how much new information human brains can process at any one time. And the second is that there is no known limit to how much stored information the human brain can process at any one time. So those two characteristics of the human brain have really important implications for teaching and learning, which we'll delve into shortly. Before we do though, let me just start by flagging the resources on cognitive load theory that we've developed at CESE, so that you kind of this is a bit of a skim across cognitive load theory, so hopefully this will give you an idea of where you can go for more information. So we've got two resources now on cognitive load theory. The first was our lit review, as Rowena mentioned, that we published in September 2017, which has apparently been downloaded over 16,000 times since then. So this was kind of my welcome to CESE. Welcome to CESE. Here's cognitive load theory, make sense of it. So the lit review provides you all the kind of theory on cognitive load theory. So you'll find information about those pre-existing theories of human cognitive architecture that I mentioned, and then the resulting cognitive load theory predictions of how human brains will therefore learn most effectively. There's the evidence base that supports cognitive load theory, so basically a whole lot of randomised control trials. And you'll also get the references to the original research that the lit review is based on and our classroom practice guide is based on. The classroom practice guide we published in November 2018. So that's apparently been downloaded over 5,500 times in that time, which is pretty cool. And that was a new type of publication for CESE. So what we aimed to do was to really strip back a lot of the theory and focus instead on what cognitive load theory means for teachers on the ground in the classroom. So you won't find any references in that publication. Okay, so I'm going to skim through. We do have a couple of PL courses that are now available online. We've also got a one-page summary and a poster, all of which you can find if you go to the CESE website and just Google cognitive load theory. All those resources are available there. So let's start with the material that's covered in the lit review, which is the theory of cognitive load theory. So according to knowledge of our existing knowledge of human cognitive architecture, the human memory can kind of be broken down into two. Can be divided into working memory and long-term memory. So working memory is where we hold small amounts of information for a very short time. You can kind of think of working memory as like that limited space in which we do our thinking. But it's very limited, so most of us can only hold a very limited number of elements of information in our working memory at any one time. probably around 7. And most of us can only hold that information for a really short period of time. So between 15 and 30 seconds without rehearsal, we have to keep bringing it back into our working memory. So learning happens when we transfer information from our working memory into our long-term memory, which is obviously the aim of teachers. So our long-term memory is where we can hold very large amounts of information, possibly unlimited amounts of information, semi-permanently. So you can think of long-term memory as kind of like a big mental warehouse where you store all the elements of information that you know, like names, words, people, how to ride a bike. Within our long-term memory, we store that information in schemas. So a schema is kind of like a chunk of related information. So if I said to you, dog, and then said, can you list a series of words that you associate with dog, and you started telling me cat, bone, furry, you're drawing on schemas held in your long-term memory. When we can draw on that information in our long-term memory, our working memory doesn't have to work as hard, because remember, there are no known limits to what we can process when we draw on information stored in our long-term memory. So drawing on that information reduces cognitive load, and it allows us to learn and to think more effectively. Now I've just given you a whole lot of information on cognitive load theory and probably given you cognitive overload. So to help kind of illustrate these concepts, I'm going to do a quick activity. So I need 2 volunteers from the audience. Who wants to jump up and get on camera? It's really unintimidating. I'm not going to be measuring your ability to process information in front of all your colleagues or anything. Thanks, Jenny. It's really easy. I'm not asking you to do cognitive science or anything. Right, can I get you guys to stand on that side if possible? Okay. So I said it was really easy. Was that deliberate? Apparently you're not on the camera. So what I'm going to get you to do is I'm going to give you each a series of 12 letters. I'm going to show you those letters on the screen. And then I'm going to get you to try and hold those letters in your working memory for a period of time. And then I'm going to get you to try and recall as many of those letters as you can. So to avoid confusion, I'm going to get the first person to look at the wall. So Jenny, can you look at the wall for a minute? I'm sorry, what was that? Catherine. I'm going to get you to have a look at the screen in a moment. I'm going to bring up a series of letters. So just see how long you can hold them in the working memory for. Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Go and look at the door, Catherine. Thank you. Jenny, it's your turn. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Jenny, I'm going to get you to go and look at the door. Okay, Catherine, can you come back? Oh, hang on. Okay, now come back. Can you tell me as many of the letters as you can recall?
Okay. S, M, B, U. I think there was like an R, an I. Yeah, that's about it.
That's pretty impressive. That's 6 letters. So you're also very conveniently fitting in around with what cognitive scientists would expect. So around 7 elements of information that you were able to hold in your working memory. So well done, Catherine. Okay, Jenny, it's your turn. Let's see how much smarter than Catherine you are. I'll tell you what, I'll give you bonus points if you can recall the order in which I gave you the letters.
Okay. M, Y, B, R, A, I, N, H, U, RTS.
That's amazing.
So cheery.
That's, good. Okay, thanks Jenny, and thanks Catherine. Oh, by the way, this was my emergency in case nobody came up. Thanks guys. Okay, so why was Jenny able to remember so many more letters than Catherine? The reason that Jenny was able to recall all those letters is because she had a schema in her working memory for the sentence, "My brain hurts." I mean, which among us doesn't? It's a sentence I rehearse daily. So Jenny wasn't recalling 12 items of information, she was recalling one. So that hopefully this activity kind of illustrates the importance of information stored in our long-term memory to facilitate our thinking and our learning. When Jenny only had to hold one element of information in her head, she could relax, she could think about other things. Poor Catherine was standing there staring at the door going, oh my God, like SM, I don't know. And think about that from a student's perspective. Okay. So that's the theory of cognitive load theory. But how can it help us in our work, either as teachers or for those of us who work in corporate roles, working to support the work of teachers in the classroom? So that is really where our classroom practice guide comes in. So what the classroom practice guide aims to do is to strip back all the theory and to just give teachers the practical implications of all of this theoretical and research work. So cognitive load theory has generated a range of what are called effects. So if an instructor does X, we would expect the effect on student learning to be Y. So for example, with the worked example effect, if the instructor gave the students a whole lot of worked examples, we would expect learning to improve. And we can measure that and we can test whether our predictions are correct. So in putting together our classroom practice guide, we took these effects and we reframed them as strategies. So it's a little bit less cognitive sciencey in the language and a little bit more teachery, and it's also actionable. So the publication lists 7 strategies that research from cognitive science, or from cognitive load theory rather, suggests would be effective in the classroom. So the element interactivity effect, which is not particularly meaningful if you're not a cognitive scientist, is translated as tailor lessons according to students' existing knowledge and skill. Those are the practical implications of the research and actionable in the classroom. The worked example effect is translated as use lots of worked examples to teach students new content or skills. The expertise reversal effect is translated as gradually increase independent problem solving as students become more proficient, and so on. So in the time that I've got left, I just want to run you through just one of these strategies. And this is one that's relevant not only to teachers, but to anyone actually who presents on their work to an audience, which is a lot of us. So this is strategy 4, cut out inessential information, or if you're a cognitive scientist, if you really want, the redundancy effect. So students or colleagues don't learn effectively when their limited attention is directed to inessential information. So inessential information might be info that they already know, it might be additional information that's not directly relevant to the lesson, or it could be the same information that's presented in multiple forms. And we sometimes assume that by providing learners with this extra information we're being helpful, or at the very least it's harmless. But research from cognitive load theory suggests that when learners are presented with inessential information, they're not necessarily able to distinguish between the information that they need to understand the lesson and then the inessential information that doesn't actually contribute to their learning. So we're asking them to do that work to distinguish between those different types of information. And cognitive load theory, or research from cognitive load theory, suggests that if teachers can step in and do that work for them, that we reduce their load. So this particular finding is particularly important when delivering multimedia presentations. So when giving PowerPoint presentations, for example, so many of us, so often, will use spoken explanations and written text, exactly the same written text, at the same time. I've been guilty of this myself. I've developed a beautiful slide and I've got a great quote and I've put a big slab of that quote up on the screen, and then I've read out from the screen. But students' working memories can become overloaded when we're asking them to both listen to the words and read the words at the same time. We're doubling up their workload. So research from cognitive load theory shows that the best strategy to avoid overloading students' working memories is to either read the text or put the text on the screen and allow the students to read it themselves at their own pace. Not both. That was a lesson for me. Okay, so that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Dan.
Thanks, Jess. I'm just going to run you through, I suppose, how the team at CESE that works on the ground, or the teams that work at CESE on the ground, have sort of seen this land in schools. So I suppose to go back to a point made previously, we've got all the resources with the publication and the professional learning, etc. Around August last year, we had a request to go and work at the Into the Deep conference, which focuses around 21st century learning and where that fits in with schools. And so we were asked to do a piece for that, and we kind of collectively made the decision that we would look at the implications that cognitive load has for inquiry-based learning. Okay, so we delivered that, and then we had a lot of response back that directors of educational leadership were interested in looking at that too. So at the Combined Directors Conference at the end of last year, with all the directors in school operations and also educational services, we delivered a workshop for them too, which is not dissimilar from what we're doing today, of about 45 minutes. And then organically, it's kind of then gone from there as far as face-to-face engagement with cognitive load theory is concerned. So just to put a little bit more context around this work as well, is in CESE we also did some analysis of school plans across New South Wales, and what we found in those school plans is that about 1,700 schools make reference to 21st century learning and its associated synonyms, the 50 odd synonyms that go with it. So 1,700 schools, and we had about 1,200 schools out of the 2,200 schools that made reference to explicit teaching. Okay, so an interesting dynamic there as far as what schools were focusing on in their school plan. So when we did that work with the directors of educational leadership, a lot of them expressed desire to get some support for their schools around where cognitive load theory fits in to that space. So since then, this year we've delivered about 35 awareness sessions across New South Wales, which, as I said, is about 45 minutes long. It's really just an awareness session. It's not designed to give someone an expert understanding of cognitive load theory. It's really designed to get people thinking about, where might the resources, what's my next step, what are the resources available, really getting them aware of cognitive load theory. So the other thing that we've been really mindful of when we do this is that we've also got a document which a lot of you would know about, which is the What Works Best document, with one of the key areas being high expectations. So one of the things that we try to do in those sessions is to ensure that there's not a contradiction between cognitive load theory and high expectations. If we talk about cognitive load theory, we want to make sure that we take that into account, but we're not dumbing things down, so to speak, if I talk in that sort of way, that we want to maintain high expectations but also take cognitive load theory into account as well. So I thought that just briefly I'd give you a visualisation activity that we use in the awareness session. So for some of you this might be going back some years, for others around the room that might be more recent. I want you to visualise, or at least think back to when you were getting your driver's licence. Or no, I'll rephrase. Think about when you were learning as a driver. You probably had that one or two key people that were helping you through. So would anyone contend that approach of having someone next to them explicitly instructing them through the process of learning to drive, would anyone contend that that's a bad idea? Let me rephrase. Is it a good idea for a 16-year-old to be given the keys to a car, a copy of the road rules, and then asked to watch some YouTube videos before they then go out onto the road without anyone else in the car? No. Okay, so we use that activity, and I'm shortening it obviously, to sort of explain the need for explicit teaching in particular, and often in a number of contexts, in the learning process. So what I thought we'd quickly do is just to show you this particular slide, which some of you might have come across before in various contexts. So this is some data that was analysed by McKinsey & Co. out of the PISA data, out of the science, I believe, the science test. So when students do PISA, they also complete a survey as part of that testing process. And what this actually shows is a bit of an analysis of teacher-directed or explicit teaching, if you will, which is kind of the, if you look at the work of Sweller and all those that are sort of expert in cognitive load theory, talk about the need for explicit teaching as far as how the brain works. But we've also got inquiry-based learning as well here. So what's important to note is that number one, these aren't effect sizes. These are just the scaled score differences in these different areas. So students that responded by saying that they had very, very few explicit teaching opportunities or explicit learning opportunities and lots of inquiry-based opportunities were minus 61. And that equates, I think, to about 10%, more than 10% difference from average. Okay. Now, those students that, for instance, had some to many explicit or teacher-directed methods and none to few sessions for inquiry-based, plus 13 compared to the average of 0, in reference to the 0 point. And then you'll notice that on the right-hand side in the middle, the many to all sessions teacher-directed and the some to many sessions of inquiry-based is actually the sweet spot associated with the learning process. And so one of the things that we talk about with this particular slide is to say, this really is the sweet spot, but how do we know where students are as far as being able to get them into that position? Okay, so what we talk about is the fact that you need that foundational knowledge. We need to get students to be expert learners or expert in that particular domain, and it's at that point that we can then direct them into the inquiry-based learning, which then has its effect after that. If we move into that space too early, we're going to lead to cognitive overload, so to speak. So we work with schools around how that works. And then the other thing that we do, and I'm going to go back a couple of slides here, is we then get to some of these strategies, and we talk about the nuanced nature between strategy 2 and strategy 3. So, and I'm guessing, can you guys at the back read that from there? No. That's okay. Otherwise I was going to break all the rules and read them to you. So strategy 2 is really the focus on modelling, explicit teaching, unpacking, scaffolding, etc. Okay, so when we think back to that previous slide that we saw, where we saw teacher-directed, that's really where that's honed in on. When we then look at strategy 3, it talks about increasing the amount of independent problem solving. So think back to when you got your licence. When you're at the point of at least an element of mastery associated with learning to drive, you were then allowed to go out on your own. Some of us, it might have been a bit earlier than it should have been, but there was at least a certain amount of explicit teaching and instruction before you went into that independent problem solving, which is driving on city roads. Again, we talk about the nuanced nature between strategy 2 and strategy 3, but as a teacher in a classroom, how do we know when to move from strategy 2 to strategy 3? And that's when we then have discussions around the importance of formative assessment, point-in-time assessment, to ascertain whether students have that mastery so that we can then move those students through. And knowing any classroom or any professional learning activities for that matter, that there's going to be varying levels of expertise, and therefore it may not be the class that's ready to all go into independent problem solving. It's going to be individuals that are at that point, and that gets back to that sort of individual approach to learning, which is important too. And we're pretty much right on time at the moment, aren't we? So that's kind of where we've been so far. In terms of where we're going, where we continue to go in this space, is that we're still responding to requests that directors and schools have for us to come and work with their networks or their schools around, just giving a bit of a taste tester of cognitive load theory. And then we've also got the evaluation capacity building team as well in CESE, who have been working in the space of evaluative thinking for a number of years and actually looking at the way that cognitive load theory in action in the classroom is a bit of a lens to look through evaluative thinking too. So that's where we've sort of come from and are going to as far as engagement with with cognitive load theory is concerned. So I think we now are opening it up to questions.